Resources Manager, Associate Director for a small 67-bed rural hospital in Northern California. I have been in human resources for over 8 years, starting in the IT industry before moving into healthcare. I do have a master's in organizational behavior. Most people ask me what organizational behavior is, and it is the study of human behavior in an organizational setting, pretty much the interface between the human behavior, staff interactions, and the overall organization and work group. I was asked today to talk about overall kind of labor relations, human resources, collective bargaining, and the pros and cons, and why staff might select a union. And so today we're going to go ahead and get started with that. So to start with, looking at our objectives today, looking at reasons why nurses might engage in collective bargaining, you need a little bit of history about how and why labor unions actually got started. Most of us know the basic history of in the early 1900s, late 1800s, there were a lot of unsafe practices within organizations, looking at coal miners, looking at the automotive industry, and the basic reasons why labor unions started was to create basic safety for employees. When you look at the true history, is a lot of why we have labor practices such as wage and hour law, sexual harassment law, things like OSHA, which is an organization that establishes safety standards for staff, is because of labor unions and their push. So nowadays it is still reason for nurses or any staff to engage in looking at collective bargaining, but a lot of the times it goes deeper than that. Most of the time when you're looking at the reasons why nurses might engage in collective bargaining comes down to things like patient safety, your patient ratios, also looking at wages. When you're looking at patient ratios, it is actually, most of our patient ratios have actually been brought about by labor unions. Looking at existing California staffing ratios, for example. When you're looking at pay rates, especially nowadays, you're looking at a very significant financial impact to hospitals. Trending in the next 3 to 5 years, you're looking at 700 hospitals closing. For nationwide, most likely 90% of those will be in rural areas. So when you're looking at wages, nurses at times will go to a labor union who promises that they will be able to get increases for nurses on a year-to-year basis. Third, you're looking at your just in general employee relations practices. Staff are looking for a standard practice when it comes to job protection. They want to know that an organization cannot just lay them off at any given time, and feel that a labor union will give them those protections. When we're looking at objective number 2, looking at strategies that nurse administrators can utilize to mitigate that risk, it's more so around listening to staff, listening to leaders, making sure that your staff, number 1, that your staff are engaged in your change management practices. So for example, if there is a new state regulation that comes about saying 2 midnight rule, for example, with case management, how is that going to impact staff? If you pull together, say, a unit council, which is a group of nursing leadership, generally charge nurses and a mixture of your staff nurses, and you engage them in your change practice, they then feel and do have a voice in your operations. So your primary strategy is really just engaging your staff in the overall day-to-day management of your unit. Looking at more of a leadership practice of partnering with your staff rather than having more of an authoritative approach to leadership. What you'll also find in looking at mitigation of risk is looking at your turnover and why you have turnover in a given area. 9 times out of 10, or there's a standard, I believe it's 80% of the time, staff leave leaders. They don't leave the organization or the work itself. So another way to mitigate that risk is to look at what is your turnover within a given unit and what are the reasons why. But the basic foundation to mitigate that risk is to truly be visible and to listen to your staff. So for example, one of my greatest strengths to mitigate the risk for unions in my own organization is I have a rounding schedule with all of my teams, whether they be nursing or non-nursing, making sure that I have taken the time, morning, noon, and night, and weekends, nurses work weekends too, discussing with them what their concerns are. What are their needs, what are their concerns, whether it's pay and understanding pay practices, whether it's benefits, whether it's a new leader, whether it is an individual who has a family concern and wondering how she is now going to provide childcare. What it does when you're that visible is you're able to mitigate the risks and issues that come up. So for example, if you have a progressive discipline issue with an employee, by being visible, you're also able to partner not only with the director but also with the employee to make sure that they are given ample opportunity to correct their performance and not put in a position where they have now done something that is so egregious that you do have to do an outright termination. Most of the time when you're looking at organizations that are able to successfully create a collective bargaining unit, when you do the background and the research, you generally will find that nurses do not feel like they have a voice. And they do not feel like they have a say in how their unit is run. Therefore, when they have a patient safety concern, they don't know where to go or who to go to, or if they do know who they're going to go to, if that person is going to do anything about it. So overall, again, the key foundation to keeping a union out of your organization from a human resources perspective or even from an administrative perspective is making sure that when you walk down the hallways, your nurses know who you are and know that they can come to you with any issues that they might have. Pros and cons to union activity. There are definitely some pros to having unions within an organization. Generally, those pros are more around an established wage increase practice. Generally speaking, union organizations have anywhere from a 5 to a 15% average increase in pay than your non-union facilities. Now, more so with the pros is you can guarantee that any employee who has an employee relations issue has an established process to go through to be heard. So for example, if you have an employee who is told that they have a bad attitude and the manager wants to write them up for it, the employee then has a guaranteed voice in their labor representative. Now, cons associated with union activity from a leadership or human resource perspective is when you do not have a union, you have a direct line of sight to your staff. What I mean by that is if your employees have an employee relations issue, they can come directly to management. They can go directly to human resources and say, help me with this issue. We can then establish a support structure in order to meet their needs. When you do have a union, most unions will have a very strict clause in their union agreements that says any employee relations issue that does come up your labor representative must be contacted first. So in a union organization, now granted this doesn't happen all the time at every union facility, but in a union site, if an employee has a employee relations issue with another employee or a physician or another manager, and they go to their direct supervisor might have to say, before we have this conversation, I am going to need to bring in your labor representative. Another con to your unions or your collective bargaining agreements is your union will charge you to be a member of their organization. Those fees can be anywhere from, say, 1% of your overall salaries and wages, upwards of 3 to 4%, depending on which organization you are in. And when you talk to some staff who are within unions, they will ask, what is the benefit of having a union? Most of the union agreements that are in place, when you read through them, are pretty much verbatim stating wage and hour law that is already in existence between your state or federal statutes. Generally, there are clarifications within a union that will give long-term staff extra benefits like additional vacation days, retirement, length of service, bonuses, etc. But generally speaking, when you talk to some of these employees who are part of unions, what they will tell you is when they want to go solve a problem either with their human resources department or their leadership, is they're told that they can't help them. The other side of that we do hear often from existing union employees is that it is really hard to get rid of a low-performing employee. So for example, in a non-union shop, and for example, in hospitals, you tend to still have a very structured approach to progressive discipline. It tends to be a verbal warning, a written warning, a second written warning, possibly a third written warning, and then a final written warning over the course of anywhere from 2 months to upwards of sometimes 2 years. These organizations have policies around the protection of staff and progressive discipline, so no one is thrown out on their feet. However, when you're in a union organization, you do have your labor representative. So oftentimes managers will not face a progressive discipline issue simply because they do not want to deal with your labor rep. What you will find by that in talking with staff is that long-term problem staff are allowed to continue in an organization and, in the words of one employee, drag down the rest of the department. Again, however, when you're looking at pros of having a union, truly when you look over the 100-year history of employee safety, a lot of that can very much be attributed to unions and how they are established. Currently today, when I'm looking at union needs, we have so many state and federal regulations that are in place to protect staff. It really is a matter of having a direct line of sight to your employees. You also have to consider when you're looking at going back to your strategies for nursing administration is how is your relationship between administration, human resources, and your staff? If your staff do not feel like they have a voice with administration and with your human resources department, they will most likely be looking to a union in order to be their voice. So to leave you with the foundational strategy on how not to bring in a union into your organization, it's to make sure that you as an organization understand and fully support that your staff are the foundation to your success within your organization. And if you do not first and primarily support your staff will look for that support elsewhere.